We're in the home stretch now. We've got a really wonderful debate lined up. This is an Oxford-style debate for those who didn't see the one earlier today. And the question being posed is, should advisory committees always vote? And this is a very timely issue. We've had some high-profile circumstances where the FDA has gone against advisory committee recommendations. There are many within and outside the government who feel that advisory committees are not useful. Some argue that the people who serve on advisory committees shouldn't be on advisory committees and others should be on these committees. So a lot has been written about these topics, and we have two academics, Aaron Kesselheim from Harvard and Jenny Kanter from USC, who are going to take the yes and no positions respectively. Aaron is a physician attorney and has an MPH from Harvard. And Genevieve has a PhD in public policy, or a PhD in economics and sociology, I should say, from the University of Chicago, and did postdoctoral fellowships at Princeton and Harvard. Both have written extensively on regulatory issues. So I think we're in for a really great debate, and I'm just to remind the debaters, each of you has 6 minutes to make your initial arguments, and then you'll have 2 minutes for rebuttal. And I'll turn it over to Aaron to get us started.
Great, thanks. So of the FDA's essential public health roles, perhaps the most prominent is reviewing evidence related to the efficacy and safety of new drugs and medical devices before they can be made widely available to patients, and determining whether a product's benefits outweigh its risks frequently is a complicated task where there are numerous competing considerations. And to help, the FDA can convene advisory committees of independent experts to offer input. So the question before us today is whether AdComs should always vote in performing their functions. And to explain why they should, I want to review 4 essential functions that AdComs play and discuss how voting supports each of them, which in turn supports the overarching goal of trust in the FDA. First, AdComs exist to gather information in the form of expert interpretations and recommendations to improve the quality of FDA decision-making. A better informed agency will make better decisions, especially on complex scientific matters. In this context, voting helps crystallize AdCom recommendations to ensure advisors' true feelings are accurately communicated. It can be hard to derive lessons from a day's worth of discussions and deliberations without a vote. Without voting, internal scientists at FDA might extract different conclusions, perhaps even subconsciously to support pre-existing perceptions. In a recent study, we reviewed outcomes from the EMA's independent advisors, called Scientific Advisory Groups, or SAGs, in its decisions on prescription drugs. SAGs offer non-binding recommendations also, but don't take votes. We self-coded the SAG summary review text. It was time-consuming and generated only 81% agreement between 2 highly skilled reviewers. Similarly, removing voting from AdComs would complicate communicating advisors' recommendations to the agency and the public. A second major purpose for AdComs is transparency. AdCom deliberations shine an important light on agency regulatory decisions, exposing the agency's decisions to public scrutiny that they may otherwise lack. Transparency is aided immeasurably by voting. In the recent aducanumab case, that Alzheimer's disease drug was subject to a heavily scrutinized AdCom meeting in which no member voted in favor of its approval. Despite being approved and repeatedly promoted by the FDA, aducanumab ended up being rejected broadly in the U.S. market as a result of unprecedented outcry from medical and public health experts. An integral part of that outcry was the near-unanimous vote at the advisory committee. A third major purpose that advisory committees serve is to enhance credibility. As you heard earlier from Dr. Kuldev, the FDA tends to invite advisory panels' judgment in scientifically or politically more difficult cases. FDA thus uses AdComs to enhance its credibility when it knows it will receive close scrutiny. Voting provides a clear barometer that the FDA can use to bolster the credibility of its decisions. In the early COVID-19 pandemic, when the FDA hastily issued an EUA for hydroxychloroquine without an advisory committee, despite lacking reliable evidence that it reduced morbidity or mortality, the move was widely perceived as being driven by political needs of the Trump administration, contributing to mistrust in other COVID-related decisions. By contrast, the FDA quickly convened advisory committees to discuss data on COVID-19 vaccines and got strong votes in favor of moving ahead with the products, which helped support uptake of the vaccines. So under the EUA, the first big step in controlling the pandemic occurred. The final key role of advisory committees in the regulatory process is for accountability and independence. They can provide the public with assurance that FDA's decisions are not being wrongly influenced by outside considerations. AdCom recommendations are so routinely reflected in subsequent FDA decisions that in the rare case in which the agency does not follow a vote, it invariably receives additional scrutiny, contributing to agency accountability. Journalists' attention after the aducanumab approval over the near-unanimous AdCom vote revealed off-books meetings between the manufacturer and the FDA, and hopefully contributed to internal agency reforms to ensure a better process in the future. Evidence of the importance of AdCom voting in accountability and independence can be seen in the FDA's rules related to AdComs. For example, while industry reps can be on an AdCom, they're not allowed to vote, which helps the FDA benefit from that perspective while still signaling to the public that it is trying to avoid harmful conflicts of interest. In past cases, the FDA has stripped votes from advisory committee members when they've given statements to the press that suggested that they may not be able to render objective advice. These steps show the importance of voting in the independence function of the AdCom. So in summary, it's helpful to remember that over 50 years ago, when the FDA first started informally convening advisory committees, there were no rules about voting. Over time, the FDA itself learned about the importance of asking precise questions and of reaching closure on what the committee actually thought, usually by soliciting a vote. In the decades since, outside experts from places like the Institute of Medicine, when reviewing the AdCom process, have repeatedly concluded on voting that it forced individual members to resolve uncertainty in an up or down manner and provide unambiguous advice to the agency. Let's not throw away all the lessons from this history because of a few cases in recent years when the FDA has received AdCom votes that it doesn't like. AdComs serve an essential role in promoting public trust. They should be called more often and in more cases that come before the FDA, and they should provide it with quality information, transparency, credibility, and accountability. And voting is an essential component of all of those functions. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And now Jenny will provide the no position.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to take up this issue and just want to start by clarifying that this position is not necessarily my personal opinion, but it is a good faith attempt to present a case for this specific position. So, having said that, I will start by saying I completely agree on the importance of transparency and accountability, but I disagree that voting is the only way to get there and that advisory committees should always vote. To really answer this question of voting, we need to step back and unpack two things. First, we need to think more broadly about what exactly we're doing when we're voting and why we vote. And secondly, we need to think about whether advisory committee members are really equipped to act as proxies for the agency in their voting for drug approval. So first, as to why we vote. So think about when we vote in our regular lives, right? We vote in presidential elections, we vote for the school board, or if you come from an unruly family, you might vote to see, to decide what movie you want to see. But, why do we vote in these specific instances? And if you ask any political scientist, they'll tell you, we vote when we need to have a single decision from a group. So voting really is simply a tool to aggregate individual preferences in a single decision. But that is not the purpose of an advisory committee. Members bring their specialized expertise, whether they're researchers or statisticians or patient or consumer reps, to the table. And the agency wants different kinds of inputs from different types of experts, usually towards a specific set of questions, something on the order of, given these adverse events or given these claimed benefits, is this scientifically meaningful? Is this clinically meaningful? Is this meaningful for the daily life of patients? So the agency uses all these inputs from the advisory committee, along with other data, manufacturing and facilities, pharmacological studies, and then they have to think about, well, what does the labeling look like, and how do we handle the risk management? So yes, the agency has to aggregate all these inputs and come to a single decision, but the advisory committee does not. And that's why the advisory committee is an advisory committee. It is not a steering committee, and it is not a board of directors. There is no need for the advisory committee to aggregate anything and come up with a single decision, which is what voting does. That is the agency's job. So which brings me to my second point, and this may get me disinvited from the summit forever, but maybe, just maybe, advisory committee members are not equipped to make drug approval recommendations. Yes, they are experts in their own specialized areas, but in an advisory committee meeting that runs 4 hours or maybe 8 hours, it is simply unrealistic to expect that these members, who all have very important day jobs, to grasp all of the considerations that go into drug approval. They are given briefing packages that run in the hundreds of pages with limited time to prepare. And even within the half-day or full-day meeting, the actual time for deliberations and asking questions is very, very limited. And we know that when we have people who have limited information or aren't quite prepared to make a decision, and we force them to make a decision, they make bad ones. We know from the psychology literature, from the survey research and marketing research literature, that when you have people who are neutral or who have incomplete information, and you force them to make a choice, the results are unreliable, unreproducible, and biased. So it's really asking too much of even our most talented advisory committee members, even Kuldev and Aaron, to grok everything they need to understand to vote for approval. So voting is not really appropriate for FDA advisory committees. And by the way, this is a stance taken by other federal agencies. So EPA, OSHA, they all have advisory committees, and these advisory committees don't vote, and these agencies don't seem to be particularly hampered, procedurally anyway, by the fact that they don't vote. As a third and final point, let me just add that having advisory committees vote has unintended consequences that we really have to acknowledge. So first, humans are cognitively limited. This means that people tend to fixate on simple things and run away from complex things. And when we have voting, people will, as you know, literally fixate on the last 10 minutes of the meeting when the voting happens at the expense of everything else that came before. The data, the evidence, the reasoning. Is it really optimal to have the public fixate on voting, which I have argued is a flawed measure? Second, the outcome of any given vote is going to be dependent on who happens to show up that day. Do we want something so important to be dependent on who happens to be able to make it, who happens to be recused, whether someone's grandson has a bar mitzvah that day? Do we really want people fixating on such a volatile outcome? Finally, voting for drug approval sets up this misguided expectation that FDA should always follow whatever the advisory committee on that day says. Well, if that were true, and if that's what we really wanted, why bother with a committee at all? Why not just collect the votes, plug them into the computer, and then instantly issue an approval after the vote? We don't do this, and one of the reasons we don't do this is because we know deep in our nerdy little hearts that the advisory committee is not there to act as a shadow agency for the FDA. The agency has many other factors to consider, including statutory and regulatory constraints that the medical experts, frankly, are pretty clueless about, present company accepted. So I agree that voting in the right context can be a good thing, but it is not the right thing for FDA advisory committees. We need expert advice from diverse perspectives. What we don't need is an aggregation mechanism that is volatile, noisy, and based on incomplete information.
Aaron, back to you, 2 minutes.
All right, so I appreciate the points that my friend made, and I just want to point out that first off, the idea that advisory committees make bad decisions because they don't have enough information, I would point out that advisory committees and FDA agree about 80% of the time. So if advisory committees are making bad decisions, that means the FDA is making a heck of a lot more bad decisions than it actually is. But I want to point out I guess I want to focus my rebuttal time on two major issues that my friend raised. The first is that the vote really isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is the deliberations that go on throughout the day, through which advisors of different expertise and come together and talk about the various issues and talk about the individual questions. And I completely agree with that, 100%. the deliberations are important. But of course, the vote doesn't discount the deliberations. The FDA still sits there all day listening to the deliberations and gets a copy of them and learns from them. And so let's figure out a way of maximizing the deliberations so that they can be maximally useful to the FDA. But that doesn't diminish the importance of voting, because voting still does provide the clarity around the recommendations that could be useful for all the purposes I talked about. And then the final thing that I wanted to bring up as part of a rebuttal point, is this idea that the voting is confusing to people, that people are somehow they think that the vote is the decision and there isn't a subsequent FDA decision, that the vote may not be 100% accurate, and I think that there's some kind of problem when the advisory committees and the FDA disagrees, and I don't think that that's fundamentally, I don't think that that's right. The trust that you get in the FDA's decision comes from the trustworthiness that the FDA earns. The FDA has to be a trustworthy institution. That's what generates trust. It's not consistency between decisions, its decisions and its advisory committee decisions, that makes the FDA a trustworthy institution. The trustworthiness is enhanced by all the principles that I talked about: accountability, transparency, getting the best information. All of those things are enhanced by voting, as I discussed. If the government was entirely consistent, if every decision was entirely consistent across all of the government in every circumstance, that's what happens in Russia, right? I mean, that's not a very trustworthy government. A trustworthy government is defined by the inputs that go into it. And when there are disagreements and there are problems between the FDA and the AdCom, and people point to the advisory committee and say, well, FDA, why did you approve this drug if the advisory committee voted against it? That tends not to point to the fact that people think that the advisory committee should be the final word on things. It points to a signal or a flag that the FDA has made a bad decision that it didn't justify, and there needs to be better insight into why that happened and what the origins of it were and what we're going to do about it.
Thank you, Aaron. Jenny, to be fair, you get 3 minutes. Aaron's a bit over. 3 minutes for your rebuttal.
Okay, thank you. So I appreciate the points that Aaron has made, and especially everything that advisory committees are supposed to do. But I'd like to take at least a couple of them a step further. So Aaron claims that the advisory committee votes give us some clarity, some information. But how good is this information? And is it really the kind of information that we want from an advisory committee to enhance credibility? So 3 things. First, journalists have reported, and our own team, along with some Penn collaborators, have found that in many cases, people's votes don't really align with what they say during the discussion. So it's not clear that there's even face validity to the vote. Second, as I mentioned, the psychology, marketing research, survey research literature, all full of studies that show that forced choice under incomplete information just gives us a lot of noise and results that are not reliable. And finally, members bring in a lot of assumptions and preferences, including things that by statute or regulation should not be included in deliberations, things like prices and the drug pipeline and insurance coverage. So Aaron mentions, the fear of political motivations entering through the administration through political appointees, but members bring in their own biases and motivations, some of which I argue need to be excluded from these votes, but are sort of mysteriously part of this voting amalgam. I mean, the fact is that we can keep what we like, the transparency, the accountability, the information from voting without keeping the voting itself. And that's because we now, as we've seen in the panel discussions, we now have AI that can summarize information from the discussions. And in some ways, that summary may be a more accurate representation than what we see in members' votes. So, ultimately, I would say advisory committees are not like the Supreme Court handing down a decision. They're more like crowdsourcing from some very smart people. And I agree with Aaron that historically voting has served the purpose of transparency, accountability, summarizing information. But with AI technologies and summarizing technologies today, we can do better. So we can keep the things that we like about voting without having to hold on to the voting itself.
Thank you both for a really stimulating debate. Now, we're not going to have a vote to see who won the debate, but we're going to, because people may have they may have already decided how they're going to vote before the debate. But what I am going to ask, how many people feel that advisory committees should always vote? Please raise your hands. And how many feel that advisory committees should not always vote? So the noes have it. Thank you both. Really great debate. And I'm going to now ask Kathy and Laura and Tina to come on up, and we're going to close the meeting.